Hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to be able to join you here tonight. My name is Jenny Lander, and it's been such a privilege to collaborate with Kinnari on this project, and we're excited to share with you what we found on this recent trip and thinking about future possibilities for legal empowerment work in Mongolia. Kinnari and I also really want to thank Emma at LAP for hosting us, and also for Nikki at Land Body Ecologies Network for hosting all of you who are here in person at the Welcome Collection. And thanks for those of us who are joining online as well. Yeah, it's great to have all the faces I can see here on my screen. Kinnari and I thought it would be helpful if I provided a bit of background to the project. So I'm an academic who's been working on issues around mining and legal issues and political issues around the mining sector in Mongolia for the last 12 years. My area of interest is interdisciplinary, looking at the intersection of constitutional law and political economy. And I've been working with Dr. Pascal Hatcher at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand for the past 6 years, looking at the impact of project finance grievance mechanisms on local communities impacted by mining, and particularly looking at the Oyu Tolgoi project, which is a really important mining project for setting precedents in the Mongolian context. Obviously, Pascal can't be here because of the time zone issues, but she's fully in here in spirit, in support. I met Kinnari in 2018 at a conference, and we worked together on an academic project about the rule of law in development projects. And we always said if we could find funding for Kinnari to come and do some legal empowerment work as part of our project, we really wanted to make that happen. And our project was funded by the British Academy and the Independent Social Research Foundation, called Extractive Citizenship. And Pascal and I were looking at how, these project finance grievance mechanisms have been shaping access to justice and conceptions of justice, particularly that interaction between private justice through alternative dispute resolution and formal justice through the courts. So obviously this is really, in terms of the practical aspect, really Kinnari's wheelhouse as a human rights lawyer with a background in project finance. So we were absolutely delighted to be able to offer a legal empowerment component as we close the project. So we, one of the key findings of our project, and one of the reasons why we asked Kinnari to come, was the realization that in engaging with alternative dispute resolution around mining, the herders that we met with had very little knowledge of their formal legal rights, and there hadn't really been any involvement from lawyers, Mongolian or otherwise. So that kind of gap between this private mechanism and the public rights was an important one we felt there was a need to address. And one of the key things that the pastoralists we have been working with for the last few years wanted from the research project was some legal education to help address this gap. And we knew the right person to ask, so we're just delighted Kinnari could come. Obviously, just before I go on to some of the kind of political and economic context to the Oyu Tolgoi project, it's extremely gratifying to finish a project that has actually potential for some real impact in the future through Kinnari's work potentially and other potential work. It's very embryonic at this stage, but there's real potential here to make a difference, and that's really exciting. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So as many of you know, Mongolia was caught up in the post-Soviet transition and was one of those economies that went through a very rapid adjustment to a market democracy in the early 1990s. And in the early 2000s, mining really emerged as the country's development strategy. And this was significantly facilitated by international financial institutions, particularly the World Bank Group. And the IFC has played an important role, particularly in the reliberalization of Mongolia's investment regime since the early 2010s, after there was a rapid fall in investment with the commodities bust. So one of the things to say about Mongolia one of the things to note is that when it went through its post-socialist transition, it really looked towards the West and towards Western financial institutions That landscape is changing as a result of shifting towards mining, and China is becoming a very important economic partner. And in some ways, there's been a kind of inexorable shift towards Mongolia being drawn into China's broader political economy. Obviously, during COVID, everything kind of stopped. There had been kind of rapid mining expansion in the early 2000s, a bit bumpy in the 20 teens. But then during COVID, it kind of stopped completely in some ways, with the borders being closed. But post-COVID, there's a real commitment to expanding mining again. And this is a context that we need to watch, because there's efforts to change provisions under the mining law, to take out consultation, that kind of thing, make it easier for investment to happen and minerals to get out. So that's kind of an important, very, very brief overview. I'd be happy to talk in more detail, but that's an extremely big overview. Next slide, please.
And just to note on that, there's also the element of, what is there? There's a lot of green economy minerals in Mongolia as well. So it's not just kind of the coal. There's also a lot of the kind of transition minerals. So there's a strong climate justice angle to this as well. Anyway, Jenny, carry on.
So in some ways, Mongolia's mining boom has been a great success. There's a huge, it's a really kind of a new frontier of extraction. It's an area where during the Soviet period, there wasn't a lot of mapping. There was some mapping, but there's been, huge scope for new exploration. And as Kinnari said, it's not just, minerals like coal and copper and gold, but there's also a lot of exploration around petroleum and natural gas, hydropower, and also critical minerals. So this is a really rapidly developing space in that sense. Mining's really kind of dominated Mongolia's economy for the last 15 odd years, at 25% of GDP, and is represents 90% of total exports. So that's a huge proportion, and it's largely consumed by China, which makes monitoring supply chains quite complicated because it can be very opaque. And also a lot of the minerals are exported in raw form, so they're processed in China, and it's very difficult to get a lot of access to information, although it would be good to try. Next slide, please. Yeah, just to kind of put this on the map a little bit, Oyu Tolgoi is a mega mine in the South Gobi region, but it's part of a larger network of large-scale mining projects, also Tolgoi, which is a large coking coal mine. So there's problems here that are cumulative from the fact that there's a lot of mining projects happening in this area. And it's sometimes difficult to get mining companies, especially with very different project finance structures, to take responsibility for these impacts. There's a lot of offloading of responsibility. So that's a huge problem. Next slide, please. So Oyu Tolgoi has had a huge amount of project financing, much of which has been corralled by the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. And in the project that we've been working on, it was herders submitting claims to the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman of the International Finance Corporation. So that's kind of the context through which this kind of claim for redress emerged. But yeah, it's a huge amount of project finance, and it's very significant to the Mongolian economy, and that makes the Oyu Tolgoi project particularly political for obvious reasons. I should also note that Oyu Tolgoi is operated by Rio Tinto, but the government has a third ownership share, so it's got a complicated investment agreement and ownership structure. Next slide, please. So mining has caused all kinds of new political movement in Mongolia, and particularly from rural areas, which is really significant. Sorry, next slide.
I'm having a bit of problem moving the slides.
So with this kind of mining boom since the early 2000s, it's created a lot of political and social conflict in rural areas for the first time. Because for the first time, Mongolia's large group of semi-nomadic pastoralists are having to compete for critical land and water resources. So it's led to a whole number of social movements and different strategies. And I'm really conscious that the project that Pascal and I have worked on over the last 6 years, it's focused on Oyu Tolgoi, and there's some unique factors about that specific mining project. I think there's lessons to learn about that can, be applied more broadly. But yeah, there's a whole landscape of strategies that NGOs and local communities have been using to try to access justice around the mining boom. So one of the things that we were really interested in was that in the complaints that herders submitted to the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman in 2012 and 2013, there were claims for Indigenous recognition, and that was a really interesting aspect of the complaints that hasn't really been addressed in, well, as far as we're aware, in Mongolian courts or in other kinds of complaints. And so there was a sense in which this project finance grievance mechanism was adjudicating whether or not Mongolian pastoralists count as Indigenous under international law, which is actually a very big public justice and legal question, and a constitutional question, actually. So, so that's really interesting that around all of these political mobilizations and new complaints, there's different kinds of legal claims that are coming up. So that was one of our initial curiosities in exploring this research. Next slide, please. So obviously water, I don't know if many of you have been to Mongolia or know much about it, but it is a very vulnerable desert steppe environment, especially in the southern region. Obviously, it's got huge diversity in terms of its ecology, but it is vulnerable to drought, particularly in that southern Gobi region. And the Oyu Tolgoi mine is very thirsty. So it's expected to use 920 liters of water per second for the next 30 years, which is a lot of water, and all of that is sourced from groundwater. So also in the context of other projects which are seeking to redivert rivers for hydropower and to enable other mining projects, this is obviously of great concern. So in particular for herders, there's been impacts from being displaced by the mine to different areas. And Oyu Tolgoi, of course, they've said that they've put in different wells and dug other boreholes, but the water sources are often not as good as they were before, or they've dried up. So there's lots of issues around water, and Kinnari will speak more to that in a moment. Next slide, please, Kinnari. Pollution is another really key issue. This is a coal truck, so this isn't from Oyu Tolgoi, but this is in the area of Oyu Tolgoi. So herders who've been displaced by the mine and also who are near to Tavan Tolgoi, there's huge pollution impacts actually from both of these mining projects, from the roads and all the other infrastructure that's been developed around them. So it's had huge health impacts in terms of for humans and for livestock. And so that's another important human rights aspect that's really been unaddressed to date and actually really needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So just before I hand over to Kinnari, I'll just give you a bit of a sense of where we went on this trip. So one of the things that the herders had asked is that we would come back to share the results of the research, and we really wanted to honor that request and also to do this legal empowerment work, which has been very exciting. So we actually initially went to Hamburg for the first 5 or 6 days, and that is the capital of the South Gobi province, Omnagov, and that's kind of it's the closest urban center to the Oyu Tolgoi mining project. So we ran a workshop there, and Kinnari will tell you more about that. And then we also spent a week in Ulaanbaatar and ran some workshops with lawyers and had other important meetings there. So there is a kind of a sense of contrast of moving between the urban and the rural, but I think it's really important, thinking forward about trying to connect these spaces well and the actors in them. Kinnari, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Jenny. So I'm going to just go into a bit more detail around what we did on the legal needs assessment. So, as Jenny said, one of the things that kind of had bothered me a little bit about what was kind of going on was this kind of lack of success with the Indigenous claim, and I'd always wondered, why we're not talking more about environmental rights and water rights, especially as Mongolia has quite a good constitution. So the kind of first part of what we did, and this trip for me was really kind of like a scoping exercise to find out first what the issues are that the communities are having, and then to kind of talk about what are the legal avenues are available, because I was very kind of suspicious about the kind of what to me seemed to be a kind of railroading of communities into using these IFC ombudsman complaints. And whilst they're okay, they're just okay, right? They're not going to change the world, and they're helpful. Don't get me wrong, they are helpful. But then, they're not enforceable, and there's lots of biases and power dimensions involved in it. So essentially, what could Mongolian law offer? I wanted to try and find out more about Mongolian law, domestic law, opportunities, and then talk to herders about essentially, what other avenues could be available in addition to the domestic law, other international treaty bodies potentially, and also potentially doing another IFC complaint, because I think the situation's so bad that there's almost something to be said for kind of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. So in terms of what issues communities are having, so just to kind of pick up on what Jenny said, drought and water scarcity, I mean, that is, it kind of cannot be overestimated, but just how bad that is. There's obviously a climate change element in all of this. Climate is obviously a multiplying effect, and if you ask, the companies, they'll say it's all climate change, but obviously there's, it's a kind of a catalytic impact, and the stress that the amount of water that's required to wash the minerals is leading to issues of underground wells drying up, increasing drought, people having to kind of dig deeper for wells, or then having to go to other parts and use money, petrol. These are not wealthy people, right? So any costs that they incur to get their kind of basic needs met is it's noteworthy. So that was that the kind of the water issue is a big one, and the pollution issue. So that was the first one. The second one, we had a workshop, well, a meeting with some families who are impacted by a tailing spill. So dams often, the sludge, the dirt from the mining, especially this is an open pit mine, so it's probably one of the dirtiest type of mines that you can have. But the kind of the slurry and the sludge is essentially tailed, right, and put into a dam, and there's a leakage there. And so we had we met some families who came to see us to tell us basically about the problems that they're having and what they're able to see with the pollution, and obviously they're using this for drinking and for their livestock. Pastoralism, the characteristic of pastoralist communities is that they use livestock, right, for their livelihoods. So anything that's damaging a water source is problematic. It seems as though the local office of OT representatives admit that there is something, there's something is wrong, but nothing's really being done about it. And they're not having any kind of talks with them or consultations or on how to fix it. There's no kind of forget about any kind of independent evidence collection or research into that. That's not happening. So those are kind of, and there were other issues. There's issues around employment, and there's there are other issues. But I think in terms of kind of priorities, if I were to set priorities, these would probably be it. These two issues: the pollution and the water. So that was the first bit. Knowledge sharing workshops. So that was more about trying to kind of get the community to see that these complaints mechanisms are not the only thing that they could be thinking about. Obviously, we'd set up to have workshops in the capital later on, so I couldn't kind of tell them what, you know, the situation with domestic law is. And anyway, I would prefer a Mongolian lawyer to do that, not me. But, you know, to at least kind of point them in the direction that there could be possibilities under Mongolian law, and that we're looking into that. We're trying to find that out, and we'll be able to tell you a bit more later on once we've spoken to some lawyers. But then also to kind of make them kind of understand the different, you know, relationships between you using an IFC mechanism. You know, the previous mechanism was very much about compensation. Compensation can be quite a divisive issue, and maybe thinking about how a new complaint can be done, which is more based on, you know, environmental rights, a right to a clean and healthy environment, and that could be a bit more like transnational in the sense that it can bring in features of Mongolian law and and climate, and that could make it quite novel. And of course, the IFC is not allowed to displace national laws, right? It's not meant to do that. It can't do that. And I think what's been happening here is that IFC have been doing what they want to do and thinking that there's kind of like nothing there that they have to comply with. And that may be a reason, because, you know, the law, that it's kind of quite an immature legal system. So maybe, you know, that kind of thought hasn't been done. And when, you know, companies do their impact assessments, you know, they very much do them from the perspective of the, you know, what are the laws that are going to be relevant to the company, which are things like property, you know, tax laws, commercial laws, security laws. You know, we might have a section on customary law, but, you know, it's not really that kind of relevant in the sense of it being relevant to the company. So, you know, there was kind of thinking about how these complaints could maybe be, a new complaint could be done potentially around the tailing, that could be a bit more sophisticated in the sense that it can be grounded a bit more in the domestic, and you know, kind of bring that to the attention of the IFC, for whatever that's worth. And then thinking also about international complaints. So, you know, what could be done around, you know, kind of leveraging any of these human rights treaty mechanisms, you know, even though they're also not really that great because they're not, you know, enforceable, some of them. And there's also an issue around exhaustion of domestic legal remedies. And that's something that I wanted to kind of talk with the local lawyers about. But so that was kind of like the part of the knowledge sharing. And then the other one, it became quite obvious after we'd spoken to people about what the problems were around, you know, evidence collection. So, you know, how can they start, what can they do now, right, on basic things like, you know, what is the value of evidence, you know, what, you know, can you write things down contemporaneously in your own words, you know, kind of, if you don't have an interest in land, and a lot of them don't have a piece of paper saying that they have an interest in land, but what kind of things can you be doing, you know, if you are, you know, buying petrol to take you to another place where you have to move your animals, that's demonstrating you have an interest in land, right? So you have to kind of keep those receipts, and, you know, so I kind of started a kind of a rudimentary discussion around, you know, what they can be doing around kind of collecting evidence and how they can be doing that. And they found that quite interesting. I think they need support, and they are kind of keeping documentation around photos. You know, they talked a lot about how they can see that kind of young trees are dying, and, you know, the types of grass that would usually be flourishing is not growing anymore. So, you know, they are kind of observing things and smelling things, and, you know, so just to kind of inform that it would be good if, you know, when things happen, to write it down then and there, you know, to write it down in their own words, to keep the date, and these kinds of really kind of basic evidential types of things. And then the final thing is to find out what it is that they want. You know, what are they after? You know, what do they want to see? And there's a lot of things that they want to see, but I think in terms of kind of just, you know, prioritizing them, for this discussion. The obvious ones are, the tailings dam issue. They're very worried about it. They want that to stop. They want, they want to be talked to. They want, they want to be consulted, and they want it to be cleaned up. They want the company to provide more pasture land. I mean, that's interesting because also what's happening is that the company's clearly violating the concession, and because of the geographies at stake, right? I mean, we're talking, the flight from Ulaanbaatar to Hang Bod is like 1.5 hours, and then there's another 5-hour drive. So, the geographical distances are huge. So it's kind of quite, you can kind of see how you're not going to get any monitoring of your license, right? And whether you're encroaching on your license or not, and who's going to be doing that? No one's going to be doing that. So there's kind of a lot of issues around license encroachment. But one of the things that communities want is that the company to provide more pasture land and, fertile pasture land. I think that's going to be problematic, given the amount of water that's being taken. More legal support, and more attention to what's going on there. So more international attention. I think Mongolia, it's kind of stuck in a bit of a rock and a hard place, right? Because it doesn't have these big networks with civil society that African countries have, because you've got kind of you have kind of these kind of colonial histories, and whatever you think about them, there is some kind of, there's linkages, right, with the West. And there is, I think what Mongolia suffers from, this kind of being very far away. I mean, there's only one domestic flight from Europe. It goes from Germany to the capital. We went from Turkey. So that's, it doesn't have these linkages and these networks, which are really, really helpful. So getting more kind of attention about what's happening would also be, is also something that the communities would quite like. More routes to access justice. I think that's kind of quite obvious. So, okay. Yeah, this is me doing this legal strategy discussion. And then, yeah, visiting herders. Okay, so let's go on to the, Jenny, is there anything else you want to add before I move on to the Ulaanbaatar?
No, not particularly, but just I guess just one point on the kind of the geography and how that affects political engagement. I think one of the interesting things about kind of social movements in Mongolia around mining is that it can become solidarity can become easily fractured, because partly because of distance, and because people really depend on family networks. So it's easy for there to be pressure put on people to be silent or to not speak out, because they have a family member who works in the mayor's office, or for the company. Or so I think some of the lessons learned in other contexts, very heavily extractive contexts like Latin America or parts of Africa, don't find immediate parallels in the Mongolian context. It has quite a unique political environment, and that's not to say, and I think one of the kind of gross perceptions and misperceptions really of mining companies has been that, oh, there's not really many people here, so we can just do what we want and it won't really have an impact. And actually it does have a huge impact, because pastoralism, even though it's a huge country and it's a small population, pastoralism really requires access to grazing, to be able to move herds around, and particularly in the South Gobi, where mobility really matters in order to not overgraze. So those are just some of the factors that I think are important, and I think that's why there's no sense in which we think we're going to go and save the day, but it's about networks, and it's about saying to the communities, you're not alone. There are people who care, and there's a lot of NGOs in UB and the capital, who are working on this as well. But one of the kind of key needs is connection between these actors and between these communities to kind of sustain long-term strategies. So that's one area where there's a real need.
So I guess that's like field building, right? And I think that's kind of, NGOs do that, right? That before you start an action, there is an element of field building, right? And getting people, in together in, solidarity. So it's not new. Okay, so in the capital, we organized a workshop. Maybe Jenny, actually, you could just, talk about, who came to that workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, so we one of the things that obviously needs to happen is there needs to be more kind of co-sharing of knowledge, I think, particularly um if there is desire to use international mechanisms, then exhaustion of domestic remedies becomes therefore extremely important. And one of the questions that we had was, Mongolian NGOs have been very involved in supporting communities, but it's not been, and also some international NGOs, which has been critical. So organizations like Accountability Council and Oyu Tolgoi Watch have played a really important role in supporting herders impacted by Oyu Tolgoi. And a lot of that focus has been around the IFC mechanism, and that's been really important. So this isn't to minimize that contribution at all, but there's been a noted absence of lawyers getting involved. And so one of the things that we've been excited about is that there does seem to be a growing network, actually, of environmental and human rights lawyers operating largely in the capital city in Ulaanbaatar, who are wanting to work together and wanting to share their experiences of trying to litigate on these issues in the Mongolian courts. And so we were obviously, delighted and honored that they gave up a Saturday, which was their day off, sorry, a Sunday, which is their day off, because they're in court otherwise. So it was a really, really productive workshop. A couple of kind of key advocacy NGOs, but most of the people who came were human rights and environmental lawyers who are actually trying to work on these cases. And that gave a really useful picture of where cases have been successful, because there have been successes in the Mongolian courts, and that can actually be and not everyone knows about that. And obviously it's often, the community that might have had a successful case that's been important to them, but that knowledge hasn't been spread to other communities. And that's not because of a lack of solidarity, but because just sheer distance and sheer lack of a network around that. So, and I think so there's been the sense of, some successes, but then also some real setbacks as well. And so they were able to give a really helpful overview of kind of where there are areas of movement in the domestic legal system, particularly in the last few years. Civil society organizations now have standing to bring environmental cases before administrative courts. But then some of the challenges as well of implementing human rights law in Mongolia. And that's kind of a shame in a way, because Mongolia, if you look at it from an outsider's perspective, it has really beautiful human rights laws. Actually, it has integrated and actually domesticated, a range of instruments. So there should be potential there to use international law in the courts, but the judiciary is quite inexperienced in doing that. So there's probably a lack of will, but there's also a lack of experience. And so that was really, really helpful for us to get an overview. Kinnari, you might want to say more about that. But
yeah, I mean, for those, I mean, it's a bit legal. We had the work translated from Mongolian to English, so if anybody is interested, but I'll, on a very kind of big picture kind of perspective, what I wanted to try and find out was, what are the kind of, what jurisdictions do they have? Essentially, they have about 4 jurisdictions. So they have a criminal law, they have their constitutional courts, they have their administrative law, they have their civil code, their civil law, and the constitutional court is, they've got a pretty good constitution, which is directly effective. Major issue though is that the constitutional court is quite a political court. It's kind of quite a few, not that many kind of judges with legal training, so they're more kind of political appointments, and for that reason they make they tend to not make human rights decisions. I think there'd also be kind of problems as to knowing what the jurisdiction would be for a human rights case anyway in the first place. The civil code, there's a problem there with standing. NGOs now have standing, and like Jenny said, the administrative law, there is some NGOs do have standing there, but from what I understood, the main issue was that there's some really weird and really strange interpretations of those standing rules, like the judges, as you know, saying things like it depends on the name of the NGO. I mean, I was quite shocked when I heard this, like the name of the NGO, if it's too broad, they don't like it because that could be, you know, that could be seen to be being a bit kind of inciting problems, political problems, if you're, you know, if it's got quite a broad name. And so you have to have a very specific name. So because like the one that we worked with, Jenny has worked with for a long time, is one called OT Watch. So, you know, that's very specific to the OT. To the OT is obviously Oyu Tolgoi, there's the mine. So it's, you know, it almost seems a bit like trying to make it a very, each NGO a kind of like a one-trick pony, a one-issue NGO, and then it's quite hard to kind of bring them together. So kind of strange interpretations of standing, which are, you know, a bit problematic. But in principle, they do, you know, they do have standing, and I think it's for child rights cases, environmental cases, and a couple of others. Yeah, like Jenny said, I mean, you know, there's issues around, you know, judges. Yeah, you know, salaries of judges being very, very low and not being paid, so that, you know, can cause obvious issues there, and a kind of, you know, a lack of training, and maybe, you know, a little bit of issues around judicial independence as well. I tried to understand a little bit more about the Mongolian, kind of like if they've got a bar association, what's going on with their bar association. And it seems as though there's, you know, there's also a bit of distrust there with lawyers, with their bar association. So, you know, there are, you know, there are some really, you know, there are some serious issues there. So, you know, they can't be hidden, but there are opportunities as well. One thing I wanted to, you know, and I kind of talked to the lawyers about was, could there be, you know, some opportunity to do some kind of legal opinion, and, you know, whether that would be helpful, you know, to kind of demonstrate that accessing justice in Mongolia is difficult. You know, the domestic, going to a, you know, a domestic court in Mongolia would be tricky. You know, with the view to, you know, would that be useful? Would that be a kind of a useful piece of paper if it's signed by Mongolian lawyers, to say, look, you know, we've got a pretty rubbish, you know, obviously in better words, but, you know, there's a kind of criteria, right? What international mechanisms expecting, I can't remember off the top of my head, but that, you know, they have criteria. So basically, you know, they do an opinion that says, in our opinion, it's not going to meet these criteria, and then therefore, you know, at least they could potentially do that could then open up potential under like the optional protocol under the ICESCR, and you know, that's kind of one that Mongolia is one of the very few countries that have signed that optional protocol. There's like 14 countries in the world that have signed the optional protocol. And that was kind of something I've been thinking right back since 2017, like, why on earth hasn't anybody used this optional protocol? So, you know, that was kind of, you know, one suggestion that I had, and whether that could be useful. And that could also potentially be useful for, you know, if there was ever any, you know, international litigation, maybe. I don't know, I'm not an international, you know, like litigator, English law litigator, so but maybe. So, you know, in terms of opportunities, you know, as I said, one thing I did think is, you know, can cases be used in a kind of way that turns this rule of law narrative? So we're not talking about compensation, but we're talking more about, you know, things like water, environment, what kind of public goods, right? And this type of narrative is used, which could be more positive. Anyway, so these are just some other people that we met, a lot of people, and we had access to a lot of people, which on one hand was very nice, but on the other hand was also a little bit troubling. So we met the Chief Commissioner of the National Human Rights Commission, who is there. Actually, this guy is in the workshop. The T-shirt, he was with the pink T-shirt around him. He's an academic, he's not a lawyer, and he was, he was quite outspoken. Anyway, I just thought I would mention him. The Chief Commissioner, National Human Rights Commissioner. Jenny, you want to mention anything about him?
Yeah, we were in, I mean, I've been working in Mongolia for 12 years now. And yeah, we were able to kind of build on the network that, and Pascal has as well. And so we were able to kind of build on the network that we've built working on political and legal issues in Mongolia's mining governance regime to draw out the human rights angle. And so we had this really great meeting with the Chief Commissioner at the National Human Rights Commission. And I think generally the human rights focus of the Human Rights Commission has been on other issues other than the mining sector in that sense. So it hasn't had an explicit focus, but there was a real openness and a real concern. And I think part of our awareness as well is how political mining has become in Mongolia, and needing to tread carefully. But there was certainly a sense of support from a national human rights institution, and a sense that they are independent and they are sensitive to the political dynamic, but they're certainly not co-opted. And in terms of things like providing a legal opinion and providing kind of a support for a legal opinion, if Mongolian lawyers wanted to access international mechanisms, there was support for that, which is significant. I mean, I think one of the things we're aware of is sometimes international mechanisms are kind of held up as a panacea or a solve-all. They can be important, I think, particularly for putting pressure on the government. And so it was helpful to talk to a number of actors about potential for using those, and then what would be necessary for accessing them. A great meeting we had was with the head of the Mongolian Environmental Law Network, who has experience in winning cases in the administrative courts. So that was brilliant. And she's also the coordinator of the Publish What You Pay Coalition, which is a coalition of NGOs that are working on transparency, particularly in mining. So that's a really important contact, I think, for any potential future work.
PWYP are basically the national chapters of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the EITI, which was set up by Blair in the 2000s. Okay.
And we these are just some of the other kind of key contacts we had. And obviously there's not a uniform opinion across all of these about how things should be developed. There's a universal concern, I think, from everyone about human rights in the mining sector, and particularly for herders, that their voices are heard. And yeah, so I think one of the great benefits, it can be a challenge as well, but one of the great benefits about the Mongolian political system, it is much more open than many other countries in Central and East Asia. There is I'm having worked there for a long time and done a lot of interviews with politicians and policymakers. I actually think there's a lot of reason to hope. There's a lot of people who are concerned about the future of the Mongolian public and want mining to benefit the country. And one of the really wonderful benefits of it being a relatively small country population-wise is you can get a sense of who some of the key players are. That can be a challenge as well, but it can be a real benefit. A lot of work can be done, and it's possible to make those important.
There's opportunities there. So in terms of where we are in kind of needs, so I think if you were trying to, if one were to do a kind of like a low-hanging fruit and a high-hanging fruit, and like try and prioritize all of this stuff, there's just so much quick wins, longer, medium term, longer term. Another CAO complaint on that tailing lead, which is a little bit different to the other one, I think could be really useful And the herder said that, you know, they would like me to do that at the moment. You know, I'm kind of looking for some funding for that. So this CAO complaint could, I think, look quite different to the previous one in terms of, you know, the kind of rights that it's invoking and bringing in the national lawyers. As I said, you know, I think that could be very powerful in terms of demonstrating to the financiers that, you know, there is a legal framework there. There is a domestic legal framework there, and there's a constitution that, you know, cannot be ignored as much as they might like to. So what else have we got? Journalism, public awareness. I think that's also a you know, one that, you know, I mean, it's, you know, if you're trying to think of like a journey or a trajectory, this, you know, it would be all the time, right? But, you know, in terms of starting it, this could be done, should be done soon, right? Like in terms of, and if anybody, you know, in this, on this call, or, you know, in the room, if they do have, you know, contacts with journalists, the Guardian has been the only newspaper actually that's been, you know, kind of following. They did a long read on the Oyu Tolgoi mine in 2015, 2016, and they did something more recently, very recently, in fact, just a couple of months ago before COP. Yeah, go on, Jenny.
Just to jump in there, one of our NGO contacts in the South Gobi is looking to do an investigative piece with a Mongolian journalist, but they are looking for funding to help fund that. The problem is there's not a lot of infrastructure for either legal work or investigative journalism, but also contacts internationally. And the piece Kinnari is referring to that was most recent in The Guardian was a brilliant piece, but really didn't talk about mining. It talked about herding and climate change. But didn't really talk about the role of mining in that mix. And that's not to valorize pastoralism as if there's no problems with pastoralism and climate change or overgrazing, but mining is an important part of the story and needs to be addressed.
So yeah, what else would you say were the top ones, Jenny?
I mean, I think it's really about networking at this point and finding funding for some discrete pieces of work that could, you know, build some important alliances and networks for long-term, for long-range approaches. I think it's really important to build that trust and to build networks between communities, Mongolian lawyers and NGOs, and international lawyers and NGOs, and for that to be sustainable. And I think, unfortunately, this is how it often works with, you know, donor funding, is it's for a discrete time, for a discrete project. And I do think this is one of the benefits of, there's also many limitations to academic work, don't get me wrong, I'm deeply aware of those. But one of the benefits of academic work is you can stay involved for a very long time. You're not bound by these cycles of funding. That's, you know, it is important to get funding, but I think that kind of long-term commitment to a network, and even though it's embryonic at this stage, there's a lot of good work that's been done, and there's a real need for a few people who are committed. Doesn't have to be loads, but there just needs to be a few people that start taking up the flag a little bit on this, I think.
And then, you know, this human rights impact assessment, I mean, I do think that is important, and that is up there as, you know, as a priority, because, you know, no one actually has done, you know, unbelievably, you know, a human rights impact assessment for this mine. You know, we have, Mongolia doesn't have law around, you know, social impact assessment. So basically that means that the IFC then does their ESIA, right? And, you know, when that happens, then it all kind of is done by consultants and, you know, who are employed and paid by the IFC. So, you know, it's a very specific remit as to what, you know, a resettlement action plan will contain, and it will not, you know, contain a kind of a human rights based approach. So, you know, to do a kind of a human rights impact assessment, I think would be, you know, helpful. And then, you know, training for NGOs and local communities, further training around evidence collection. and that might be more about, finding a local Mongolian lawyer. I'm not suggesting that, an international, somebody from Europe goes there, but it's more about, and I don't think that would be suitable either, is to, have a local lawyer there who can actually do that. Language is an issue, right? So we had a translator with us the whole of the time. A lovely lady called Seren, who now lives in Australia and is doing a PhD. But yeah, language is an issue. So we had a translator. So that also really does need to be factored in. Yeah. And yeah, supply chain analysis, that could also be a medium-term thing. Like Jenny said, it kind of goes into a black hole as to where this, where these minerals are actually going. They're clearly being refined in China, but then where are they going after that? Are they going to Volkswagen? Are they going to Germany? Are they going to, Fiat? Where are they going? Are they going to Tesla? Are they, that's an interesting question, and I don't know how you would begin to answer that. And it would be interesting because obviously now in Europe, we're getting a lot more mandatory human rights legislation, right? So it's another pressure point. So certainly the German Supply Chain Act. I mean, yeah, you could then write to, if you trace it, then you can write to the CEO of these companies and say, look, that's actually very powerful. So that's another point, pinpoint. International litigation. I don't know how on earth we'd go about doing that, but I think Rio Tinto is listed in the UK, and it's there could be something there to look into. That's obviously much. I think that's that's a long-term thing, right? But it could be interesting, really interesting. So I think we've talked enough, and it is now 7 o'clock. So thank you all for listening and bearing with us. If we have like 10-15 minutes for any questions either in the room or yeah, thank you.
I have a question. I read in one of the Guardian articles that there was a settlement agreement between Rio Tinto and the community. My understanding is that what's been going on is that they're not complying with what's in this agreement.
Yeah, so basically that's an agreement that was entered into in, when was it, 2015, Jenny? The tripartite agreement, 2019, yeah, 2019. There's been a couple.
So there were 2 complaints in 2012 and 2013, and then they opted for dispute resolution facilitated by the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman. And that resulted in these really landmark agreements, and they really are important agreements, and they do cover compensation, aspects of employment, issues around water, although the herders rejected the findings of the team that assessed the water impact. They weren't happy with how that went. But yes, it does cover compensation. Yeah,
they're broken down. Basically, there's that's the kind of one thing that the herders that we spoke to are unhappy about. The process has become it's between the company, the local SUM, is that right? And then
so it's actually a really novel institution. So it's this tripartite council between herders, local government, and the company. And one of the challenges has been is how does it work to just elect herders onto that in a context where herders don't have any special recognition? They're just treated like, well, they are just Mongolian citizens who do herding for a livelihood. And so there's been some challenges with kind of people who really aren't engaged in herding, who haven't been directly impacted by the mine, who are sitting in herder seats. So I think that part of that's been ironed out, I think, over time, but there's been a breakdown of trust, and it's become quite factionalized from what we understand.
And actually that Guardian article wasn't, it kind of, the very first long read Guardian article was like all about how the herders have won, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
And I've been trying to get in touch with them to, that narrative does need to kind of be rewritten a little bit. Well, not, it needs to 180 degrees be rewritten, right? Because it's not accurate. So yeah, that
Yeah.
there's some ongoing issues around that.
Yeah, I guess sort of, I think that was an old article, so maybe they were hoping that it was some sort of success.
Yeah.
Just backfired,
Yeah.
as these things often do.
I think it's also important just to say there is quite a narrative, I think, within Mongolia as well, that the herders impacted by Oyu Tolgoi are kind of complaining because they've gotten some of the best treatment of any, there are many herders who are impacted by Chinese mining projects who get much, much less in a way. But I think it's important that because Oyu Tolgoi does have a kind of a precedent-setting role, it is a very visible mining project. So the kind of justice that's achieved through Oyu Tolgoi, that actually becomes quite important in shaping outcomes potentially for other herders who are impacted by other internationally financed projects.
We have a question.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about the status of the herders. Did you say that they did get Indigenous people? So they're not classified as Indigenous?
No, because the sticking point with that is that national identity in Mongolia is nomadic, right? And under international, international kind of thinking around who is Indigenous requires it to be a minority. So you've got a bit of a,
It's probably the question probably won't have been picked up by the.
Oh, okay.
Just around the status of.
Oh, so the question was, the status of the Indigenous claim, and is that right? And how it?
Yeah, well, I just wondered how it fitted in with the herders, whether they had that status of Indigenous people or not, or how they could maybe get that. That's
okay. Yeah, the status of herders as Indigenous people. So I mean so the benefit of self-identifying as one of the benefits is increased kind of participation, and then benefit sharing, and kind of participation and consultation, and the right to a veto of a project. If it to go ahead, you have special rights. The issue is that the way that international readings of who is Indigenous require that generally Indigenous people are a minority, and that the issue in Mongolia is that the whole country is, they have a nomadic Indigenous, that's their culture. So it doesn't work in this type of context. It also kind of can happen in in some African countries as well. But I think that's kind of losing kind of sight of the bigger issue, which is around consultation and participation, which is not happening at all. So yeah. I think somebody has raised their hand. Baya, you'll have to unmute yourself though.
Thank you. Yeah, I really don't have like specific questions, but more or less, I just want to have some comments, and because it seems like I'm actually writing my PhD here in Germany with the Max Planck Institute on how human rights, particularly environmental rights, are ineffective in environmental in mining induced environmental disputes, especially in South Gobi. So it's in many ways it's kind of like overlaps your studies, and I'm really wanted to like establish some kind of collaboration and connections in the future, if it's possible, because I'm also, in my background is I'm a lawyer, and I practiced law, but not on the community side, on the mining company side for over 10 years. And then I taught national school in law school about environmental rights, environmental law, and mining laws. So many of the things that you have discussed here is I share a lot of sympathy, and I'm really pretty much looking forward to, I don't know, like this is accidentally I found this email from my colleagues, and they're going, so I don't know how to in the future to collaborate and connect with you. Is it like are you guys planning to like have a meeting in regularly, or I don't know. I really wanted to know how to collaborate in the future. Thank you.
I should have put our email addresses on the slide. I'll put them in the chat. But it would be
Okay.
brilliant to be in touch with you. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, my role as the academic lead on this project, our project's finished this year, but Kinnari is the one who's kind of thinking about taking some of the legal work forward, and I'm continuing to be involved in terms of supporting that through the network I have in Mongolia. And so it's still very embryonic, but we would love to be in touch. So thank you.
Yeah, in terms of cases, I mean, like I spent a lot of time in local courts archives looking at the cases from 2012 and earliest 2004, and there are actually 6 cases I was using environmental rights in the local courts argued. And even though they were not successful in sense, but it didn't actually brought by local citizens, but instead local governments. In terms of water cases, the local governments passed in 2012 very big resolution saying, okay, that the water of the South Gobi is the property of South Gobi residents, and if Oyu Tolgoi wants to use it, there are many things to discuss. How what are the limitations in local domestic legal avenues, and why these people want to go to like this ombudsman avenues. So I'm pretty much looking forward to discuss in the future. Thank you, and learn more about your project.
Yeah, sure. Someone else in the room.
I think that last time we were here, like we had like an interesting chat on Philippe's son presenting on the book Last Colony, and then how he addressed like the colonization of like Chagos. And then it was very interesting like to see like the strategy, and then how much time it was like on the strategy and the questions. What questions are you putting forward to the court? In that case, it was the International Court of Justice. I can see you're still exploring avenues, but I guess my question is, for instance, in the US, when you think of litigation of this type of cases, like the Obama administration or Gina McCarthy, all these people have been advocating for staying away from human rights, and then putting much more the emphasis on public health, safety, and economics, and then bringing like the discussion on the economics and the economical kind of harm on the long term. But they were kind of thinking that on the long run, they would be much more strategic and impactful than the human rights avenue, especially in the US with something like environment. Is it too early to judge more or less where you think that you are going? Do you have a sense or a gut feeling on any reflections on this?
It's a bit too early.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah. Is there any other questions?
I guess a very simple one.
Yeah.
How many people would you say are affected? Sort of, is it, how big are these communities?
Jenny, the question was, how big are these communities that are affected? How many people are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think there were about 70 families affected by the Oyu Tolgoi project.
70, right?
Yeah, 70. So we're not talking like, vast numbers, although that is families. So these are family networks that, so that's, 70 families I think were compensated. And some were directly moved and others were directly impacted by being displaced by the mine, and others were indirectly impacted. But I think it's really important to know as well that like when one family gets moved from their customary grazing land, that impinges on many other people as well. So it has kind of it's difficult to calculate, but I would say I think there were about 70 families. I'll double check that, but I think it was 70.
Last point.
That went, so because they have customary grazing right, so when one, it's like a knock-on effect, isn't it? So if one family has to move and move to another family's like area, then it has an impact on them. But on the tailings, I think there was about 20 families. Is that right for the tailings?
Yeah, so I think 20 families in terms. I mean, I think the concern with that is not just for the families immediately affected, but just in terms of pollution for the entire area and kind of especially for groundwater. So that's, I don't know if that helps. I think it's important to say as well that Mongolians do have a customary access system, but it's not kind of like customary law in some contexts, say in East Africa, for instance, where it can actually be adjudicated. It typically has been the local government that has had that role, but now there's competing interests for the local government in terms of supporting mining or supporting herders. And the local government oftentimes does quite a good job at trying to represent herders' interests. Local governments have, done things like trying to grant little paper certificates, white paper certificates to herders to say, we recognize you've been using this land, to help them with compensation claims, but these have not held up in court. So there's a bit of a gap in Mongolian law. There is a customary system, but it's not formalized, and that's a real problem.
Okay. They have recognized title to land under customary law in Mongolia.
Well, they do. It is recognised that they're customary rights holders, but they're obviously not given, certification or evidence.
There's some countries where
it's
not even recognised, so you're starting from an obstacle because you can't demonstrate the right for them.
Hi, I had a question, if there's still time.
Sure.
Hi. I don't know if I missed, I was just multitasking a bit, so I don't know if I missed a part of presentation, but did you get to know if there was already some litigation pending or some sort of legal action that was domestically already taken? And, or was the jurisdiction too immature to handle such issues with respect to?
First of all, Lakshmi helped with some of the research that we did before going. So I'd just like to say thank you to Lakshmi for doing that. It was really great and it was really helpful. There was one piece when we talked to the PWYP. They were talking a little bit about a criminal action, weren't they, against Rio Tinto of a kind of corruption, I think. From memory, that's the kind of one action that I was, I'm aware of.
Yeah, there hasn't been a case around the kind of social or human rights impacts.
Not the social and human rights, no, around this mine, no.
Yeah, there have been some other cases in other parts of the country where herders have brought claims through an NGO on the basis of the constitutional right to a healthy and safe environment and have had some success. But that hasn't applied yet with the Oyu Tolgoi case. And there have been problems of winning a case, but then, the licenses get given back. So they're cancelled, but then, then they're reinstated. And so there's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards with those things. But there has been some in other parts of the legal system. Yeah.
No more questions. Well, thank you all.